And welcome to video 2 on lesson 2.1 for congruent figures. And hopefully you have taken some notes on identifying congruent figures, and you'll notice that it's what we already talked about in video 1. So it shouldn't take us too long to go through this, because it says that congruent figures are congruent when their corresponding angles and their corresponding sides are congruent. Well, that means they're the same size. That's what that means. So in these two triangles, they are obviously the same shape. So notice it didn't say anything about shape to identify congruent figures, but we're going to talk about it as we go through. One thing I do want to talk about is the congruent statement that's here. You might want to label or write a congruent statement if you have not. So I'm going to rewrite that right here. ABC is congruent to DEF. Notice, congruent statements have to be written in a very specific way. And that is saying that if A corresponds to D, so A and D are corresponding, and wherever I write those, they got to be in the same location. So we wrote A first on this one. Notice we wrote D first on the second one. So they are in corresponding position in the congruent statement. Same for B and E. B corresponds to E. Same for C and F. C corresponds to F. So that congruent statement puts parts in specific corresponding order. And you can see, we can do a lot of the things. I could say side AB. That means this side right here, the red side, well, obviously it's going to correspond to DE. Notice they're in the same order, right there. Right there. So congruent statements are very specific because they list the parts in corresponding order. Nice. So we are going to identify congruent figures. In other words, we have to tell whether these two figures are congruent, and we're going to explain our reasoning. So once again, we're going to talk about shape. Just in general, I look at these two figures, and they are generally the same shape. They are both trapezoids, so we're not going to worry about shape. We're going to worry about size. And when it comes to size, we got sides, and we got angles. And we want to know, are they congruent? Yes or no? Okay? Well, the easiest thing to start with to find out if two figures are congruent when it comes to size, the easiest thing to notice right away, especially when things are labeled, is the sides. Are the sides congruent? Are they the same length? And I'm going to look and I say, hey, wow, on the top figure and the bottom figure, I see that these slanted sides are all 5. That's good. But then I notice that up at the top we have a 2, and on the bottom one on the top we have a 3. So those do not match up. So we don't even care about the angles anymore. We already know that these are not congruent, because the lengths of the corresponding sides are not congruent. So the figures are not congruent. I'm going to use the symbol because corresponding sides are not congruent. Now, I already know, because I've done this for many years, if the corresponding sides are not congruent, the corresponding angles are probably not congruent in this particular figure. There are figures, though, where corresponding angles are congruent, even though the size and the sides are not. And we can talk about those later. Let's move right along. Tell whether these two figures are congruent, again, to explain our reasoning. And, of course, we can see the shape is probably good because we see two triangles. Notice that they are not in the same orientation. One points up, one points down. So this is what I'm talking about. They're not always going to be oriented to look exactly the same and go the same way. So again, we're going to go to the sides, and I notice that, hey, we have a 5, and a 6 on the, and we also have a 5, and a 6. So we're going to go sides, congruent, check. That looks good. And then we're going to go to the angles, and I see that attached to this side 6, I have the two angles with one mark in it on both of them. So that looks pretty good. And then, of course, the double mark is opposite. So angles. Check. That means these figures are congruent. Yay! Moving right along. Using what we know about congruent figures. Using what we know about congruent figures now to answer some specific questions about figures. And they're telling us in this particular one that this triangle ABC and the triangle DEF, they are in fact congruent. So I can write a congruent statement. Oh, backing up real quick. Oh, we can't write a congruent statement on this one because they're not labeled. Oh well, there we go. Back to this one. Sorry about that quick interruption. So we're going to look at these two, and I can write a congruent statement here. I can say ABC is congruent to DEF if I wanted to write that congruent statement, because they told us they were congruent. So now we're going to answer some questions about these congruent figures. And A says, what is the length of side EF? Well, I know that side EF, by my congruent statement, has to correspond to BC. And when I come over here and take a look, here's side EF, and lo and behold, it does correspond to side BC. And I notice that BC is 8, and if those two are corresponding and these figures are congruent, then I know that EF has to be 8 meters. Has to be. Question B says, what is the perimeter of DEF? Well, if we know that the two figures are congruent, then the perimeters have to be the same. So if I take and add up the side lengths of ABC, ABC equals 8 plus 8 plus 3, which is 19 meters. And ABC corresponds to DEF. So the perimeter of DEF has to be 19 meters. Make sense? Gotta be. Following that logic. If you follow that logic, you're going to do really well when you get to the real geometry class. Alrighty, once again, here it says that figure ABCD is congruent to KLMN. So we know they're congruent. That means we know they're the same shape. We know that all congruent Boy, I'll tell you, I'm having a hard time speaking with this video. I hope you're understanding me. So it's the same shape. All corresponding sides are congruent, and all corresponding angles are congruent. We know that when they tell us figures are congruent. So we're going to answer these questions. What is the length of side CD? So now again, I'm going to look. If I look at my congruent statement, CD has to be M and N. And then if I look at my figures, well, CD is down here, and M and N is down here. Well, MN is 10. So since, oh man, I'll tell you, it's going to be one of those days. Since MN is equal to 10 inches, that means that CD must equal 10 inches because they are corresponding sides in congruent figures. B, which angle of KLMN corresponds to angle B? Well, once again, we can go up here and say angle B is right here. It corresponds to angle L because it's in the same location in the congruent statement. And sure enough, here's B corresponds to L. So, angle B corresponds to angle L. So my answer, angle L. What is the perimeter? This is C. What is the perimeter of ABCD? Well, we know that ABCD, we have these three sides, 5, 4, and 5. So 5 plus 4 plus 5. We don't know CD, but we did learn it back in question A because it corresponds to side MN, and side MN was 10, so CD was 10. So we can add the 10, and we can say that the perimeter is 10, 24. So the perimeter of ABCD is 24 inches. Using corresponding figures to find answers. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I gave you this quick write, so please make sure that you complete it, answering all those questions. We'll be using that for a structure in class tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, when you are done, you are done. Hopefully you have taken some quality notes. Everything you are doing, you are autographing your work with excellence. Thank you for tonight. Have a good rest.